lost that medical school in the Know Nothing riots in the 1850s. We had to separate the medical school out from St. Louis University because supposedly, according to the Know Nothings, the Jesuits were doing unspeakable acts in the basement of the medical school. De facto, the Jesuits were not doing dissections, but the doctors probably were. And to save the medical school and the university, they separated out as separate entities individually. The irony of it is that some years later, an institution called Washington University in St. Louis bought that medical school. Washington U's med school is the old St. Louis U med school. We picked up a medical school in the 1905 or so. But the Belgians were the supreme pragmatists in coming. The Italians were much more devoted, not that long, much more devoted to the way things were done, or at least the language in the which way things were done in Europe, than, let's say, the Belgians would be. The Germans, they came in many cases, well, especially in one big case, from under the Kulturkampf in 1870, and they were pushed out of Germany. They wanted to see why and how things were different here, that was not happening here while it was happening there. But one of the things that helped on getting people to adapt, if you want to call it, to American society was that many of those first groups from foreign countries came because they were thrown out by anti-clerical governments. But as soon as a, quote, liberal government came into power in any European country, the first thing that happened was the Jesuits were thrown out. Inevitably. We underwent, I think, under Father Beck's, who was General 1853 to 1883, we underwent something like 20 exiles from not only Europe, but Latin America and so on. And here was this crazy Protestant place here in the United States that never had such a thing, never had people pitched out for religious reasons. It couldn't be figured out in some ways in Europe, but it made a difference when the people got here and saw the way they had been treated shabbily over there, and despite the anti-Catholicism over here, treated very well by the Catholics here, the immigrant Catholics, who above all wanted to move ahead. And one of the ways in which you moved ahead was education. Now, the parishes took on an educational system that no other place in the world has ever done, the parochial school system. No place. That was the primary school education. That's what brought the immigrants, Catholic immigrants, into the mainstream of American society better than anything else. Those among them who wanted to go beyond that, who had the talent and whose families had at least enough money to scrape together the $37 tuition annually, started out at one point, they would send them on to the college. The college that they tried to resuscitate in the model of the old Jesuit college before the Suppression. And it became perfectly clear after a while that you couldn't run the colleges in this country the way the old pre-Suppression colleges were done. So they began to move to other things. For example, the insistence or the non-insistence, by the way, it was especially the Midwestern schools that were much more pragmatic than the East. We got rid of the absolute necessity for Greek, for example, to get a bachelor's degree long before anybody else. And the Midwestern schools betrayed the ratio studiorum. You know, that was the plan of education for the Jesuit schools back from 1599. They betrayed it, and they betrayed the society by founding schools of business schools. Absolutely betrayed it. In the minds of some of the people in the Eastern schools. And you can find the document for that kind of thing. Then what about women coming into the schools? Again, a pragmatic situation. There were women who wanted to get an education, first of all. But what are we going to do? This was the opening wedge. What are we going to do about the nuns? Fellow religious, such as we are, male religious, female religious, who have founded these hospitals. They want degrees. Where are they going to get those degrees? They can't start their own schools. Can they go to the Jesuit, who the majority of the schools? Can they go to Jesuit school? God forbid that they should do so in the colleges, under no circumstances. Well, if we have a school of nursing, what can you do about it? Or if they come and we get a school of social service going, which is not the same as the college. The colleges were single-sex male long after women were in some of the other schools. Law, for example. Medicine was much later. But the nursing schools were the ones that drove the wedge in, again, for a very pragmatic situation. Now, you're not from St. Louis, you are, but did you know there were women who went to St. Louis U High?
No, I did not know that.
The nuns at St. Mary's, the Sisters of St. Mary, big hospital situation they had. Some women who entered their convent without finishing high school. They couldn't leave the convent. God forbid they should leave the convent to go to school. So Mother Concordia, the director of the Superior General, made an arrangement completely ex lex, outside the law, with the rector and the principal at St. Louis U High, that their courses, some of which would be given by Jesuits who had come out to the convent, but others given by the nuns themselves, would be counted toward a high school diploma. It was all sub secreto, secretly, and outside the law. Only a few years, but it's wonderful to tell the males from St. Louis U High that there were some there. Yes, the question.
Kind of following on from Steve's question, one of the things, and I'm trying to think if this is one of the sort of takeaways, I wanted to ask you about, is provincial identity then intertwined with national identity? Because you talked about sort of German Jesuits and French Jesuits, and I think you'd say there's an American identity, right? The Midwest, and we might even tease out if there's a sort of Midwestern provincial identity that's different from an Eastern.
Certainly no longer. To a degree, yes. As I say, the Belgians and the Germans who immediately followed them in this part of the country were supremely pragmatic. The East Coast people were much more wedded to the old way of doing things. Now, quite why, I'm not sure. But Fordham was founded by the Archbishop Dagger John Hughes of New York, and he gave it to the society. It was called St. John's College. He gave it to the society. We didn't know how to do anything with it. He offered it to the society. There was a little college, Jesuit college down in Kentucky, founded by French Jesuits from the Lyons province. They picked up lock, stock, and barrel and went to New York, and they became the original group at Fordham. But the French Jesuits were very much imbued with the tradition of classical education, Greek and Latin, literature, and so on, much more than the Belgian and German group here. So they hung on to that kind of a thing in their schools way after we did here, way after. The national identities, people kidded about it a lot in the society. The Missouri province was strict und straight, so they would say. They did not make that big a difference, except in the curricula of the schools. For some time, East Coast versus Midwest. The Italians who founded basically the Oregon province and the California province were so busy, especially in California, just keeping up with the immigration. They had no time to do any other than get the schools going and keep them going under the pressure of immigration. The immigration very greatly transformed the schools. And one of the things that came out of that, not just out of us, the Jesuits and Jesuit schools, but for the first time in the history of the Roman Catholic Church, we have today, and we have had now for a couple of generations, a mass church which is an educated church. We've always had mass church, many people in the church. We've always had an educated church, but small numbers right from the beginning. There's always been an educated church. But the fact there is a mass church, a large number of people who are well educated, is both part of the triumph of what American Catholicism has produced. It's also part of the present problem. Because if you get an educated church, people are going to ask questions. And much of the clergy simply doesn't know how, not only to answer the questions, but how even to perceive of what the questions are about. We've sowed, in some senses, the roots of our own problems with people walking out on the church today. Now, we've been going at this for 2 hours. As I said, I'll go on interminably, but I think we better.
One more question. I know people have to go, but do
Sure,
you have
yeah,
another question?
I know people have it.
One last one for John? Anybody?
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Canada, and that the Treaty of Paris, 1763, the English take over Canada. There's still a French and I assume a Jesuit presence in Canada. A year later, the Suppression begins. Does any of do the French, the Canadian Jesuits go back to France? Do they?
You mean at the time of the Suppression?
In Canada, yeah.
Um,
or do they stay out there and wait for the Quebec Act?
If they were French, they were sent back. From when France threw the Jesuits out, whatever Jesuits were still up there were sent back. Now it's also some of the French Canadian Jesuits who came down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, or down to New Orleans. They were sent back too. The last Jesuit.
And they're all gone within a year?
How long? No, it took a little longer than that to get them out and send them back to France. But the last one surviving, who did continue in this country, Father Sebastian Morin, some way or other convinced the officials in New Orleans to let him alone. And they said, okay, as long as you never advertise yourself as having been a Jesuit or being a Jesuit, you can continue to evangelize basically through the mid-Mississippi, around St. Louis, up the Illinois River, and so on. He continued there and died and was buried at Kaskaskia, one of the old French forts across from St. Louis. He never lived to see the restoration at all. When the Jesuits came to Missouri in 1823, got themselves settled at Florissant. This is emblematic of an attitude. When they got themselves settled, it took some years. Then they went over to Kaskaskia, dug up the body of Morin, brought it back to Florissant, which was the headquarters, the home of Missouri province, brought it back and buried it there in the first spot on the hill, so that the Society of Jesus, in its restoration, has a living link with the Society of Jesus before the Suppression. That's a very good example of how carefully, how clearly it was not meant to be theoretically, canonically in their minds, a new society. And they tried, the rules and everything else should come back, but they were interpreted and they had to be lived in a different circumstance. Now, the Canadian Jesuits themselves, the French, they came back again after the Revolution. They came back to Canada, and New York and Upper New England was for a while part of the Canadian mission of the Jesuits. Later, with the Canadian Jesuits were separated, or rather split into two provinces, French-speaking and English-speaking Canada. They still have the two provinces up there now. But they pretty well resisted anything to do with the United States, Jesuits. And we had enough to keep ourselves busy down here without any desire to colonize them up there. I think that's probably the general kind of statement I made. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.